in terms of the buy-in, it brings us nicely, I suppose, to the leadership panel, which is going to be the main closer of the day before we bring us to closing remarks. So I'm really delighted that everyone has come and given your time today. I know you're all very busy, but it's been kind of frequently highlighted throughout the day how important the role of the leaders are in this discussion. So I'm really delighted that we can be joined by Dr. Michèle Glacken. Hopefully Michèle is online. She's unable to join us today. Just something came up for her quite late, so we have to beam Michèle in online. Hopefully you're there, Michèle. So Michèle is the Registrar and Vice President of Academic Affairs for Atlantic Technological University. Also have a colleague, Dr. Ross Wood from the HEA, who's heading up the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning. We also have Professor Sarah Lavin, who's standing in today for Lindsay Malone, who is the Director of FET in Waterford, Wexford ETB, but Sarah is joining us today and brings really rich expertise in inclusion as an adult education officer in WWETB and the head of learner support there. And Professor Eeva Leinonen, who's the President of Maynooth University. So we're really excited for all these to join us. So finally, our last participant is David Nevin, who's the Senior Manager with the National Apprenticeship Office. So it's really great as well to get the tertiary viewpoint here. We have a really rich panel. If it's okay with AV, I might sit down and join the panel and use microphone number 1, if that's okay. We're having mic number 1. Ah, that feels much better now. How are you? We're going to have a nice, lovely chat now. Yeah, no, listen, I suppose it's come up just again and again throughout the day about we cannot do this without the leader's view. So I'm actually going to go to Michèle first online, if that's okay with you, Michèle. Actually, no, do you know what? I'm going to start with David, if that's okay. Sure. I'm going to start with David because I want to get the apprenticeship view, because I think it's quite different, actually. Apprenticeship is often associated with assessments that are of a very practical nature. Maybe it's skills demonstrations, for example. I'm kind of wondering, for you, what are the implications of inclusive approaches to assessment in that context, in that sort of nature of assessment? What might be needed to advance more inclusive practice in the area in the view of the NAO?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I think taking a slight step back on this, in terms of apprenticeship for all and access and inclusion, inclusivity in apprenticeship, I suppose we've been slightly behind the curve until now, and but now as part of the National Action Plan for Apprenticeship 2021 to 2025, Apprenticeship for All is a key tenet of that, and a lot of that work is being accelerated by a subcommittee that we've set up on access and inclusion, a head or a member of that committee, and that's driving a lot of great work that we're doing that includes kind of program design, assessment, and a number of other areas. I think in apprenticeship, what's kind of unique, and it was touched on earlier, with an apprenticeship is that it's work-based learning. So you spend 75-80% of your time in work, and the remainder in classroom or in a workshop, and that means then that the employer is a really key stakeholder. And that is a key stakeholder, and I suppose as part of that you have on-the-job assessments, and so those on-the-job assessments are very much linked to the learning in the workshop, in the classroom, and that role of the employer and the kind of is really important in how we engage the employers, and particularly around kind of inclusivity, and I think, Head and FIT have done some really good work in that space, creating kind of a tip sheet for employers on, I suppose, hiring apprentices, and being more kind of inclusive in how they go about hiring apprentices, apprentices with disability. I think what underpins a lot of kind of our work around inclusivity, whether it be through kind of curriculum design or assessment, is the data, and that's an area that we're really trying to kind of work with at the moment. So we have a national apprentice survey that's going to be launched shortly, and as part of that, understanding kind of learners who have disabilities, whether they've declared them or not, and their experience of the system, including assessment, is going to be fundamental for us to understand how we might, address any issues around kind of assessment and enhance the experience for all kind of all apprentices going forward. When we think in terms of the apprenticeship system, you've got two types of apprenticeship. You've got craft apprenticeship, which are the more traditional apprenticeships that we would know, such as electrical, carpentry and joinery. And you have consortia-based apprenticeships, such as sales, which we heard from earlier. And so there's, the number of apprenticeships has risen dramatically in the last 8 years. And now we have 73 apprenticeships in situ. We have another 40 that are in progress. And with that brings kind of a whole diversity in terms of assessments, practical or otherwise, and that's brilliant. I think, we saw some great examples of that, in terms of the approach that's being used in Mayo Sligo Leitrim and the sales apprenticeship. Really fantastic work being done there. I think when you look at, say, some of the craft apprenticeships, when it comes to practical, there's a diversity of apprenticeships that we offer in the craft system. So you've got your tests, your exams, your practicals, you have your skills demonstrations, drawing, that kind of thing. But I suppose, they're all mandatory, on the craft system. And, is that being inclusive? There's a question there. And there's probably more work that can be done in terms of, on the craft side as to how we kind of make those assessments more inclusive, and that we kind of provide support for kind of the learners. But yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I know for our own work, actually, I think even though you could argue there's a lot of inclusive assessment stuff going on in the apprenticeship zone, because a lot of they are kind of skills based in many cases. But I think there's an argument there, particularly from our cohort for disabled students, that it has actually even increased importance in apprenticeship, that we look at inclusive, proactive design of assessment, because of the fact that there are so many stakeholders involved in the process. We have the HEI, the ETB, the employer, sometimes the coordinating body as well. And that actually the more we can do to design out those barriers, is going to make that transition and that between those different stakeholders much easier. Eeva, I might move on to yourself. From our discussions and from some of the practice that we've seen today, it's very clear that there's a lot of support and commitment across the tertiary sector to advancing kind of more inclusive practice. So I'm just wondering, I'm conscious that today, like somebody mentioned it already, that there might be an element, a little bit of preaching to the converted, like if you're in this room, you're already kind of interested type of thing. And that to affect that systemic change, that we need to kind of reach those hard to reach people really, and kind of convince them to engage in this topic and to be motivated to do that. So I'm just wondering if you have any views really on what's necessary within our institutions to support the sort of cultural change that might well be necessary to embed a set of principles like these within our practice.
Yes, thank you very much for that, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to be here for the day and actually listen to your conversations, but I've had some colleagues here who have briefed me, so I have a bit of a sense of what today was about. The question that you're asking has cultural change, I think, at the core of that, and how do we what are the steps we need, or what do we need to have nationally in the frameworks or institutions to enable scalability? We are all enthusiastic about the agendas that you're talking about here. We all understand the centrality and importance of them, but how do you actually make them happen across the institution? That's what you're really asking about. So I have a few ideas on that. I'd like to think first a little bit about national frameworks. And I think you had a discussion today here where you talked about the principles that UCD has worked on, and how might those become or be a cornerstone for some national principles. And I think that's a really good approach. So my experience in national frameworks is actually very positive. They can be very helpful, but they have to be done right. And what I have learned over the years is that national frameworks have to be flexible so that we have opportunity to adjust them to institutions and different disciplines, but they also have to be very robust. And by robustness, I mean that they have to be somehow, institutions have to be accountable for the fact that they are somehow engaging with these principles and assessment practices. I worked for quite a lot of my career actually in the United Kingdom, and I worked with the Quality Assurance Agency, for instance, on their codes of practice, and a lot in the institutional audit space. And one thing that I learned about national frameworks, for them to be effective, they have to be enhancement focused rather than compliance focused, which is really a big difference in how people approach. And I think I've also worked about 9 years in Australia in higher education. So if I then look at Ireland and UK and Australia, I think the national frameworks are stronger, perhaps in the other two constituencies, jurisdictions that I have worked in. And maybe that is something that we like to think about and focus on. So then I just thought about, how do we, I was looking at the UCD, the draft principles that you discussed, and I think commend everybody for the excellent work. They're really excellent principles. But as a leader of a university, when I look at them and I think, how might we implement these? How might we make these work in a university or educational institution? I think we need to always think about being simple and being clear, because then there is much better understanding and easier understanding across a whole range of different disciplines how to apply them. So there's about 10 of those principles. So, if possible, could we have 3 to 5, which sounds like it's quite reductionist, but I think that would be quite good. And also clear in terms of being clearly actionable. So I think something like that would be really useful to think about. And then a couple of other points as well that I like to make, and one of them is about putting the student at the center of what we do. So why are we doing any of this? So ask that basic question. We are doing any of this because we want to benefit the student. And we want every student to have an opportunity, the same opportunity to succeed and the same opportunity to actually shine. And if you have that mindset as institutions, you start to see things quite differently. It's really quite interesting. So there's a bit of a need for kind of really strong, we all believe in that, but the sort of mindset set kind of change that then goes through the institution. And 2 other things I like to mention is commitment at the highest level in universities for inclusivity in a broad sense, EDI, but also, of course, assessment. So it's really important, in my view, that inclusive assessment, but more broadly EDI, is embedded in strategies, university high-level strategies, because they are approved by governing authorities, which then is the roadmap for us as the president and UE and the whole university to take it forward. And in our new strategy, we have actually universal learning designs called out as something, as a driver for our university going forward. And then very finally, I wanted to say, which I know that you've discussed here, is about thinking about inclusive assessment in a broader student experience space in terms of retention, progression, completion, because these are really important national agendas. So if we are able to show how inclusive assessment actually enable us to advance these national agendas, that would be a really good way forward. And then I just heard you talk there before we started, where you were saying about the time. So obviously, for cultural change, we need to enable our staff to engage. And time is one of those important elements of that. And we also have discussions about whether some of this staff development should be compulsory, engagement in frameworks and assessment principle across university, compulsory. And that's an interesting debate to have. But I think there has to be some mechanisms through which we have a broader reach and scalability. So there's a few thoughts.
Just a few. Fantastic. Absolutely fascinating. I'm really glad you brought up that concept of how we kind of embed these at the strategic level of our institutions. It's something in a head we're thinking very deeply about, and we're part of that cross-sectoral development to build the National Charter for Universal Design, which really is kind of, if we're going to introduce a set of principles like these, which are mostly focused at the departmental and individual level, then actually that needs to be really supported through a whole range of strategic signposts at the strategic level. And I think Ross will probably have plenty to say about how it interacts at the national level. But Michèle, we might jump to yourself online. So I know you're someone who's shown a lot of leadership in developing a systems approach to supporting UDL practice in ATU Sligo. So I'm just wondering, do you have any lessons to share from that experience in terms of kind of cultivating that sort of cultural change and creating institution or provider level systems that might support inclusive assessment? We can't hear you there, Michèle. Is there 1 second? Do you want to try again there, Michèle? Okay, we have a little trouble with the audio, so I might come back to Michèle afterwards and bring Michèle back in at the next question. So Ross, I said I was coming for you soon, so I'll come to you now. So we know there's an important statutory function there of the HEA to advance equality of opportunity, diversity and inclusion in higher education. I'm just wondering, from the systems level perspective, obviously Eeva kind of pointed to the importance of how these principles are kind of followed up on and reported on, and there's a level of kind of oversight there. So I'm just wondering, from the systems level perspective, what do you see as barriers to achieving a more inclusive higher education system, and maybe what steps do you think are necessary to kind of shift it all forward on this?
Yeah, thanks, Dara. It's funny, everyone seems to be always coming for me. It's I joked with Roisin, it'll be like the end of a Western where I'm in a saloon trying to shoot my way out the door by the end of the day. But anyway, I just, Dara, I just was thinking that like the term barriers and a lot of what we talked about here, without, I think, wanting to be, has been slightly on the negative side. And what I think that we're focusing an awful lot on staff who are resistant to this approach. And I think from our experience in the main, and I know other people in the room will probably agree, for the main, most staff want to engage and want to adapt and want to have better practice and so on. So I think that's a positive. But at the same time, while there's training in place and it's good, there is still a way to go in terms of the capacity building generally. One of the barriers that I seen, and it was interesting, I was listening to Geraldine describe the principles, and also earlier on in the talk on artificial intelligence, one of the things that kept jumping out at me was disciplinarity, and that the issues really arise at discipline level. When you produce kind of a high level set of principles, and we see this a lot in terms of embedding different approaches into the curriculum, is that the issue is at the discipline level. The lecturer wants to know, how does this fit with my work? How do I put this in here? And I think that one of the things that was really interesting about the TU Dublin project, and even in Geraldine's slides, was the move towards presenting practical examples and giving people the tools to follow. And I think that while there's a barrier there at discipline level, I do think that there's also an opportunity. The same for AI. If you think about AI, everyone, I think, now accepts it's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. One of the things that struck me about the talk earlier on today was we were talking about training students in the use of AI within a specific discipline, which was digital education, I think. So there's a real applicability there. In other disciplines, there isn't. And this is the sort of thing that we need to think about. And this is where I see a very strong barrier in terms of academics and teachers and so on. And I'm conscious from my previous QQI life that I'm not just speaking to the higher education sector, but that is the main area I work with at the moment. I think ultimately I see two main issues, two main barriers. One is at the strategic level. You mentioned it yourself, Dara. Eva's touched on it. This really needs to be raised up onto the senior management agenda. An agenda which has an awful lot of competing demands. So we want space for everything, but there isn't space for everything. And it's about how do you get something like this on the agenda. And then also the second thing, and David I think was talking about in terms of apprentices, but data is a big issue. Like a lot of what we hear is anecdotal, and to develop national policy, you need a lot of hard data. And I'll talk a bit about those two things if I may. The first one is in terms of the strategic level. How is this work valued? How do our organisations or institutions value the redevelopment of assessment methods? Okay, so we talked about time. It's not just about time, it's also about recognition. We need to develop a system where if someone is going to go to the effort of redesigning their approach to assessment, that's recognised. And I think there's a role there for the HEA and the National Forum in terms of professional development and professional recognition. In terms of the data, my question would be, and this is a barrier that I see at national level, is what's the baseline? What are the national priorities? I mean, we're moving towards that with the principles and the framework. And I'm not just talking about data on assessment practices. What I thought was really interesting in Joanna's talk earlier on was the need to produce data on the cost benefit of this type of approach. So Dara, I know you've talked at length about how it costs more money to run 100 separate assessments than it does to actually build inclusive assessment in the first place. And I think that we really, one of the barriers is that we think that the moral and ethical imperative is enough, and it's not. That isn't how the real world works. And I think that from my previous role in the HEA and EDI in relation to gender equality, it was one of the ways that we cracked that nut was that we realised that it was no longer good enough to just talk about that this was the right thing to do. We had to show people that not only was it the right thing to do, but it led to better outcomes. And I think that that's what we need to get to here. So I think we need to move beyond exposition of the problem and to start demonstrating how the solution is not just a solution which will benefit students, but it actually benefits, well, it benefits all students, it benefits all staff, it benefits everyone. And I think that that's a narrative that will actually help then to bring those people who Geraldine frightened with the PowerPoint slide, to bring them along. So I'll stop there. I could keep going on, but I think I'll just stop there.
No, that was really good, and I think obviously the forum has such a big role to play in terms of that impact evaluation piece about taking that leadership role in teaching and learning. So it's great to have you back in the saddle and have the forum really powering ahead again.
That's some compliment, Sam. He's coming for me.
So we're going to move to Sarah next. Maybe AV could give me a thumbs up that we have Michèle back online, and we'll move to Michèle after that. But Sarah, we know, I suppose, that inclusion is kind of very fundamental to what ETBs do, to the mission of ETBs. Cognizant of the very huge breadth of provision that happens to diversity of learners in ETBs, I'm just wondering, given that context that you're operating in, do you anticipate any particular challenges or indeed opportunities in operationalising principles on inclusive assessment, like the ones shown today within an ETB context? Yeah. So in other words, what do you think needs to happen next in order to support the practice?
So thank you for having me. It's great to be here. I'm sorry also I couldn't be here for the whole day, but I have read the document and commend. It's a fantastic set of principles. So I think, like what you're saying, I see opportunities and challenges, but I do firmly believe within FET the opportunities outweigh the challenges. And I think FET is very uniquely positioned in that inclusion and inclusion practice is embedded and has been such a part of what we do. And I think part of that is our roots in adult and community education. So community or education in the community for the community, education focused on social justice and social inclusion, flexibility of delivery, and things like that. opportunities outside of the mainstream formal. I'm thinking of things like Youth Reach and our apprenticeship programs or what have you. So I think like assessment doesn't happen, on its own, right? So it's very much linked to teaching and learning. And I feel like the inclusive teaching and learning with FET is our greatest strength. So I think that the opportunity is to build on that history and to build on the ethos, the inclusive ethos of those that work within FET. So that would be like the first opportunity that I would see, but certainly then, and then to bring it to more recent times, UDL has been very much embraced within the FET sector. Certainly you can see that across the board, and we look forward to implementing it further. And now with the charter altitude, I think that's an opportunity, because I think that gives great opportunity for teaching, learning, assessment. And so for FET, when I say that that's the greatest opportunity, I don't think it's a huge step to bring that inclusive practice into assessment. And I think it would be widely welcomed. In fact, when we've gone through our process over the last few years, working with FETAC and QQI, we've been able to embed some of that inclusive delivery, inclusive practice into our programs. So I'm thinking, even in assessment, sometimes I'm thinking of things like the skills development or skills demo, and continuous assessment, only using exams when absolutely necessary and for purpose. So in that sense, but to speak to the challenges, I think that FET has probably not had the structures that's been available in HE. So each ETB looks very different. And so in terms of, as you were saying, a strategy and rolling that out and implementing it, sometimes implementing things can be slow and just getting everyone on the same page. So in our ETB, I'm from Waterford and Wexford. I am an adult education officer, and my specific remit is around EDI, learner support, and access, including adult safeguarding. And we're lucky enough that we have an access and inclusion officer. We have learning support coordinators, but that doesn't exist across the board. So I think that that's a challenge. The second challenge is, like, much of inclusive practice is cost neutral, right? But I think the funding and the resources to implement a framework like this, or the charter or what have you, needs to be looked at within the FET sector. Particularly, I'm thinking of PLD, professional learning development, and capacity building of staff. So much of the teaching staff within FET are paid on an hourly basis. So they're part-time contracted, and they're paid for each hour that they teach. So getting involved in communities of practice, doing PLD, can be problematic sometimes. And so that would be a challenge. But outside of those practicalities, I think culturally, I would see it as an opportunity for the FET sector. I think culturally it would be very much welcomed because matching up to the teaching and learning. And I think a framework like this, rather than bring challenges, would actually answer some of the challenges that we currently have. And I don't want to go over too much, but just to give a concrete example of what I mean by that, for our apprentice program, we have a learner support system where every apprentice who comes into the WWETB is presented with all the supports that are available across the spectrum, from health and well-being to maybe extra tuition. So what can sometimes happen is an apprentice might self-identify, might be going for some extra tuition. Dovetails with that, the coordinator works with instructors around embedding UDL and inclusive learning environment. So this particular apprentice might present that they could possibly, let's say, have dyslexia. And so we're working with their instructor on an inclusive learning environment. We're working with them. And then when it comes to assessment, sometimes it can feel a little bit like a cliff edge, because they don't have an official diagnosis, nor can they afford to get an official diagnosis. And sometimes that's a barrier for the individual accommodations. So I would see inclusive assessment as actually removing those types of barriers.
And I think as well, one of the things you highlight there as an opportunity, maybe, or you maybe touched on as an opportunity, if you weren't explicit about it, actually is is the whole move towards the unified tertiary education model.
Absolutely.
And actually,
yes,
like you mentioned, some of the strengths there of FET, and that the really strong culture of inclusion that exists within FET, and certainly like the very high level of teaching qualifications that exist in FET, maybe comparatively to HE, and then maybe HE having a lot of structural pieces where we've done a lot of thinking over time. I think there's so much benefit in bringing practitioners and indeed leaders together in those spaces to learn more. Michèle, I might come across to you. Hopefully we have you on audio. Yeah, perfect. We can hear you loud and clear.
Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. Thanks.
So just to reiterate the question there, you're someone in ATU who's shown a lot of leadership in developing very much a systems approach to supporting UDL practice, and you've had that recognised at the national level with a John Kelly Award from UCD and Ahead. I'm just wondering, do you have any lessons maybe to share from that experience in terms of creating these institution level or provider level systems that might support inclusive assessment?
Yeah, thanks very much, and thank you for a very enjoyable day. Apologies I couldn't be with you, but I've learned so much, and I think if you could bottle the enthusiasm, it would just be wonderful that's here. But I suppose from back in about 2017, I suppose the then legacy IT Sligo really made the commitment to really universal design, and universal design for learning being part of that, because it recognised that we needed a whole institute. That if we were going to have universal design for learning, we needed the estates, we needed everybody on board. So we committed a strategic plan at that very early stage. And we also committed ourselves into a compact document, which meant we had to return back to the HEA. So we had that commitment at a very early level from the strategy, and it will be going in our new strategic plan, which will be launched for ATU this month. So it was making that, and it'll be in our performance review again. So it's making that very clear statement. We set our own KPIs and we have to meet them. And I think that does help, where you have that and have a universal perspective that is not just in the academic arena, it's in all. Very much, I suppose, aligned now to the Attitude Charter, that we have to have the physical environment, the digital environment. So we got that at a very early age. It's a change project. It's very much a change management project. So we had to start at the beginning, and you could go back to Lewin or wherever you wanted to go back to, and the freeze, the unfreeze. We had to sell that idea. We had to actually create an awareness and get a conversation going with our staff, because everybody comes from a different lens, and that's fine. And so we needed to understand everybody and where they were coming from, and then support them at the different level. And we also took our students on board at a very, very early age stage, because we wanted to see, was it making any difference to them? And we wanted evidence that what we were doing was making a difference to their learning experience. And then we put in, I suppose, we know I'm not that far from the academic world in terms from teaching, that we knew we had to make it as painless and as easy as possible. So we did a number of things that made things we feel easier. For example, in our module manager, when academic module manager, when staff are developing their programs, we have built in terms of various prompts and ideas in terms of how to write their learning outcomes to be inclusive, in terms of different teaching and learning strategies, and they link directly to a resource body, a set of resources in terms of different types. So if we say you want to do a podcast, okay, how do you do it? We've given them the rubrics. We do everything we can. We've also built in Blackboard Alley into our, and that checks the accessibility for, we also invested in instructional designers to help academic staff design their assessments in a different way as well, and built up a bank of resources for academic staff. We felt that was really important, because we will always get, and you can see in the audience today, you have the innovators, you have the early adopters. So it was trying to bring others on board as well. Now, it is a journey, and it isn't one person that can do this. It's a team of people. So we had set up a team to lead this. And I just want to give a shout out to Dr. Niamh Plunkett, who is the best person to sell anything in a university. And it is that passion. She demonstrated the passion, and her team demonstrated that passion, and that really progressed things within the university, because when people can see that passion and that there is the resources to support them, and they're not being left. So we took people at where they were. So if they wanted just knowledge awareness, it was knowledge awareness. If they were at the level where they would participate in a digital badge, if they were in awareness that their CPD wanted to go up to master's level, we had all those options. So we weren't pigeonholing, or not just giving no choice as well. And we work very much as a team. And I think that's really important. And it's a team across the university to try to embed universal design. And it's not an easy task. And it needs multiple ways of recognising people and what they're doing as well. I think it's really important to try to keep people's interest and keep them encouraged. And I think they were key words. And I would like to also acknowledge in tutor and the also support that has provided to us, because we've had to be able to bring in both student and academic champions to support the champions we already had in place, but they have been instrumental in moving our progress in the area of universal design and universal design for learning in the last 18 months. They really have helped us, because we've been able to embed champions in schools. And that is where we can help people at the programme and module level to develop.
Thanks so much for that, Michèle. No, look, it's really important. I think one of the things that's striking me there is the importance of collaborative effort in what you're saying, that if we don't understand each other and where we're at and what the barriers and challenges are, so if we don't design these solutions together as institutions, and that's very much what the Altitude Charter is trying to do, is trying to encourage much more collaborative effort on this. And having been sold a few things by Niamh, myself in my time, I know you're absolutely right that she's a great salesperson. So just as a closer, to try and get people away hopefully on time, I'm going to ask you in no more than 2 or 3 sentences. I'm going to be strict. You have to choose your words carefully. In no more than 2 or 3 sentences, if we go along to the group, and I might start with you again, Michèle, on this. If you had a magic wand, what one change would you like to see happen within the system to support the embedding of inclusive assessment into the future?
I think if we had the adoption of the Altitude Charter, because we adopted the Altitude Charter, we have a universal design. So we have to address everything from the teaching and learning to the sports, to our physical environment, to our digital environment. I think that if, as a higher and tertiary education sector, we adopted the Altitude Charter, I think that would encompass everything that we want to try to do. So if you only allow me one thing to do, that's what I would want to do.
And I didn't pay her to say that either. Eeva, we might move to you next.
That's such a difficult question, A magic wand. I now have a different wand, having listened to you all today. And that would be that Michèle mentioned that everybody has a different lens. Ross talked about disciplinary differences and lenses. But I think we could all have the one lens, and the lens is that everything we do is with the view to benefiting the student. And if we looked at everything through that lens, I think that would be a wonderful magic wand. Thank you.
A magic pair of glasses maybe as well. I love that. Might move over to yourself, Sarah?
Yeah, Michèle stole my first answer, because I think that I have to say Altitude, I think it's monumental, and I think because it was delivered and developed for FET and HE, and a real clear map of implementation. So that would be first. And the second magic wand would be, I suppose, the funding and resources to follow in terms of creating inclusive environments, inclusive assessment. At the moment, there is no mechanism. As you know, the FSD there's a lot to talk about. Mainstreaming FSD is certainly needed, and it's for individuals. But I think some funding specifically for implementing inclusive.
Brilliant. In terms of the apprenticeship context, what do you think, David?
For me, I suppose it's a dedicated community of practice around this in apprenticeship. I think there's lots of pockets of great work and excellence, but I don't know if that's kind of being shared. Particularly in an apprenticeship context. So I think that would be, for me, something that would be great. Yeah.
I think it's a great opportunity to do that with the rapid expansion right now in apprenticeships. There's so much learning to be had by bringing people together in that. And Ross, finally over to yourself, last but definitely not least.
I was just thinking about time again. Time. And this is a bit of a plug too. As soon as you got your plug in, one of the things that the National Forum worked on a lot up to the end of 2021 was a professional recognition framework for staff who teach. And I think if I had a magic wand, then I could put that in place today, which would give staff across FET and higher education recognition for the work that they do in developing their courses and developing these innovative assessments. And it would actually lead to, promotions or recognition or whatever for staff. I think that would be a real game changer, because it would put it on a different level. And I think ultimately from a teaching and learning perspective, what we'd like to see is parity of esteem for research and teaching and learning specific to the higher education space. But that needs to be done via some sort of recognition framework. So I think recognition for all the great work that everyone is doing, rather than, I see people, I'm sorry, this is more than 3 sentences, but I see these people who are doing great things, and I said the Russian before, there are great things happening across the country in every single educational institution, from primary schools to secondary schools to FET colleges to higher education to wherever. And a lot of it is isolated, and the people doing it are innovating in amazing ways. And sometimes the only recognition they get is when they come and they stand up here on stage and present the work that they've done, and we all give them a round of applause, and then they go back to their day job. And I think that that's something that needs to change.
I think that's a fantastic way to finish. Can everybody give our leaders a big round of applause? Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Folks, I'm conscious that it is our close time. I just wanted to make a few thank yous, if possible. First of all our brilliant presenters and panellists who gave up their time to prepare for and participate here today. You all have busy lives and careers, and I think the quality of contributions today has been really excellent, so thank you very much for that. A huge thanks to our partners in Head and Dawn, who have been instrumental in the planning and delivery of today and who run a very tight ship, let me tell you. To all of our colleagues in QQI, of course, for supporting us here today. The AV team, who have made what you've seen is quite a complicated tech operation seem really quite seamless and taken a lot of stress away from us. So thank you, and to the hotel for all of your support. To everyone here and online, thank you for your participation and engagement. I think it's been full of passion, full of ideas. I was particularly struck by Joanna's words earlier. Assessment for inclusion is a perpetual endeavour requiring robust conversation. And I think as you go back to your organisations and your own contexts, we'd encourage you to engage with your colleagues, with your students, and on some of the ideas and discussions we had here today, to consider the kind of concrete steps that you can take to try and translate some of those ideas into tangible actions that can really advance more inclusive approaches to assessment and standards. For our part, we will, in partnership with stakeholders, progress those principles we talked about, and that they will hopefully inform and guide that work that you're doing, and as part of our own review and update of QQI's broader assessment infrastructure. So thank you once again, and I just wish you a safe journey home. Thank you.